The Mandalore arc in the Clone Wars is by far some of the most emotionally brutal Star Wars storytelling out there. And one of the most devastating moments in the entire show is, of course, the throne room scene where Maul impales Satine right in front of Obi-Wan. In a few seconds, the series takes this calm, idealistic pacifist and turns her death into a weapon, using her as leverage to break one of the most composed Jedi we've ever seen. That moment doesn't just hurt because Satine dies. It hurts because of what it does to Obi-Wan. We watch the same man who once joked, "so uncivilized," after blasting General Grievous, suddenly stand there completely powerless, forced to relive the trauma of Qui-Gon's death while Maul gloats. It's one of those scenes that silently explains why Obi-Wan becomes the lonely hermit on Tatooine, and why Mandalore eventually becomes a shattered world, haunted by the Purge. But I thought it would be fun to ask a very simple, what if? What if Maul's blade doesn't finish the job? In this alternate timeline, the strike is off by inches, or Mandalorian armor plating slows it, or Bo-Katan's forces reach the throne room just fast enough that Satine survives long enough to be stabilized. Through miscalculation, intervention, or sheer Mandalorian stubbornness, she lives. Now that one change might sound small at first, because in Star Wars, people survive worse all the time. We've seen Maul himself crawl back from being cut in half. But Satine surviving doesn't just spare one life, it rewires everything around her. It changes Mandalore's fate under the Republic and the Empire. It twists Maul's entire revenge arc. It pulls Obi-Wan's choices in a different direction. And it even reaches forward into Rebels and The Mandalorian, where her ideas could still echo through Bo-Katan, Din Djarin, and Grogu. So in this video, we're going to treat that missed killing blow as the branching point and walk through the entire new story in order. We'll start in that throne room on Mandalore, follow Satine's recovery during the late Clone Wars, track how her survival reshapes the Siege of Mandalore and Order 66, and then move through the rise of the Empire, all the way into the era of the Rebellion and the Mandalorian. As I said, the goal is to put this whole alternate timeline into a clean, linear narrative, so it actually makes sense. Now, there will be major spoilers for the Clone Wars, Rebels, the prequel trilogy, and the Mandalorian, since we're going to pull from all of them, and then rearrange events to see how they change. So, there's your warning. Now, let's get started with the exact moment Maul's plan fails, and Satine Kryze refuses to die. So before we race off into a brand new future for Mandalore, we need to set some ground rules. I thought it would be fun to treat this almost like we're running a mission briefing for an alternate squad of characters. Satine, Obi-Wan, Maul, Bo-Katan, and the Empire itself. Our organizing principle is simple. We take every relevant canon event that touches those 5 pillars, keep the official timeline in our sights, and then branch everything at one precise moment. Maul driving his blade through Satine in the Clone Wars Season 5, Episode 16. In canon, that's where she dies, Obi-Wan is shattered, and Maul cements his revenge. Here, that exact scene still happens, but the outcome changes. The stab lands, the emotions are real, the stakes are the same, yet Satine does not die on that floor. To make that work, we need clear rules for this what if. We're not going to drop in random Deus Ex Machina powers or mystery artifacts the show never hints at. Every change has to be plausible inside Star Wars logic. Advanced Mandalorian and Republic medical tech, the limits of the Force, and believable political reactions on a world that's already torn between pacifists and warriors. Character choices have to feel like extensions of who they were on screen. Satine doesn't suddenly become a berserker warlord, Obi-Wan doesn't abandon his Jedi discipline overnight, and Maul doesn't turn into a mustache-twirling cartoon. If something shifts, it's because this one's survival pushes them there step by step. As I said, that also means a lot stays exactly the same. The broader Clone Wars still rage across the galaxy. Anakin still falls, Palpatine still executes Order 66, the Jedi Order still collapses, and the basic structure of the original trilogy is intact. Luke and Leia are still born, the Death Star still looms, and the Empire still rises. The difference is that the path to those events now has to bend around a living Satine Kryze and a Mandalore that doesn't neatly slide into the background. Now, there will be major spoilers not just for the Clone Wars Seasons 5 through 7, but also for Rebels and The Mandalorian. We're going to take out-of-sequence episodes, scattered lore about the Purge, Maul's later appearances, Bo-Katan's hunt for the Darksaber, and smooth them into one continuous story. So, there's your warning. We're essentially doing for Satine and Mandalore what we did for that one clone squad, pulling every piece into a single, clean narrative. Now, let's get started by stepping back in time. Before we can save Satine, we have to understand who she is, what Mandalore became under her pacifist rule, and why Maul was willing to burn an entire world just to hurt Obi-Wan Kenobi. Satine Kryze is one of those characters where, the more you understand her, the more you realize how much the galaxy hinges on her choices. She isn't just Obi-Wan's old flame, or that pacifist on Mandalore. She is a survivor of Mandalore's darkest days who decides, very consciously, to walk in the exact opposite direction of her people's history. As a young woman, Satine lives through the Mandalorian civil wars. Clans are tearing each other apart, armor and jetpacks are everywhere, and she spends a year on the run under Jedi protection. That experience doesn't turn her into a tougher warrior. It turns her into the leader of the new Mandalorians, a political movement that says, "We are done with this." She helps build a pacifist regime in Sundari, strips away the old warrior government, and turns Mandalore into a neutral, demilitarized world in the middle of a galaxy arming for war. Now, this puts her in a really strange place with the Republic. Officially, Mandalore is neutral. Satine refuses clone garrisons, rejects joining the war effort, and speaks out in the Senate against militarization. At the same time, she needs galactic stability for her fragile society to survive, and she still has that history with the Jedi from her time with Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon. So there's your warning. She's constantly walking a tightrope between principle and practicality, and the Clone Wars are sawing at the rope. Of course, not everyone on Mandalore is on board with no more warriors. Death Watch sees Satine as a traitor to everything Mandalorian. Led by Pre Vizsla, they were the ones polishing the armor, quoting old battle glories, and dreaming of a return to conquest. Their partnership with Maul later turns that nostalgia into outright terrorism. From their point of view, Satine isn't saving Mandalore, she's gutting it. That internal opposition is why her government looks stable on the surface, but it's politically brittle the second someone strong enough, like Maul, decides to push. What makes Satine compelling is that she doesn't just talk pacifism. She lives it with stubborn, almost infuriating moral clarity. She refuses to arm up, even when it would be easier, stands unarmed in front of her enemies, and keeps choosing diplomacy while other leaders are reaching for blasters. Her courage is quiet, not flashy. That's inspiring, but it also leaves her very exposed in a galaxy that is, episode by episode, sliding into total war. And then there's Obi-Wan. As I said, their shared past during the Civil Wars plants the seeds of a relationship that could have gone a very different direction. We get those moments in the Clone Wars where the mask slips. Obi-Wan admitting he would have left the Order for her, Satine teasing him with that dry Mandalorian humor. If you had said the word, he tells her. In canon, he can never fully choose her path of compassion and restraint, because the Jedi and the war keep pulling him away. Now, I thought it would be fun to treat Satine as a kind of mirror held up to Obi-Wan and the entire Jedi Order. Where they accept being generals, she insists on remaining a pacifist. Where they compromise with the Republic's war machine, she keeps arguing that victory through violence is just another form of defeat. She represents a road not taken, not just romantically, but philosophically. And that's exactly why her survival changes so much. If that mirror doesn't shatter in front of Obi-Wan in Maul's throne room, his entire emotional timeline, and Mandalore's, start to bend in new directions. Pattern interrupt time. Think about how different Maul's revenge actually looks if the woman who embodies Obi-Wan's compassion refuses to die on cue. Now, let's get started on what that survival would mean once Maul seizes Mandalore and the Clone Wars close in. Now, to understand why that one moment in the throne room is the perfect branching point, we have to rewind Maul's entire revenge timeline leading up to Mandalore. This isn't just some random duel, it's the culmination of years of festering hatred. Maul goes from being presumed dead on Naboo, cut in half and dropped down a reactor shaft, to being dragged back into the war by Savage Opress. Broken in body and mind, but absolutely laser-focused on one thing: Obi-Wan Kenobi. Maul's recovery is brutal. He's patched together with mechanical legs, ranting in the shadows, and Savage eventually brings him to Mother Talzin, who restores his sanity and gives him purpose. From that point on, Maul doesn't care about the Republic or the Separatists in any ideological way. His whole strategy is built around hurting Obi-Wan. He starts picking targets that will draw Kenobi out, he allies with criminals, and he begins quietly building the Shadow Collective so he can become a player big enough that the Jedi have to pay attention. As I said, that's where Mandalore comes in. Maul realizes that if he wants to inflict a wound that goes deeper than any lightsaber strike, he has to hit Obi-Wan's heart, not his body. Satine isn't just a Duchess. She's Obi-Wan's unresolved what could have been. Maul senses that emotional attachment and decides Satine will be both bait and punishment. I thought it would be fun to really highlight that he's not just seizing a planet, he's weaponizing a love story. So he engineers a political coup. With Death Watch, Maul stages attacks, then has his own forces save Mandalore, making Pre Vizsla look like a hero before betraying him. Maul defeats Vizsla in single combat, takes the Darksaber, and installs a puppet regime that keeps Satine imprisoned while he rules from the shadows. Mandalore's warrior heritage, its neutral status, and its iconic armor suddenly become props in Maul's personal revenge play, giving him the legitimacy of a Mandalorian ruler and the resources of a proud, fractured world. Now, there will be major spoilers for that throne room scene, so there's your warning. In canon, Obi-Wan arrives and is immediately outplayed. He's shackled, forced to watch as Satine is dragged before him, and Maul monologues about the pain of loss. Satine, bruised but still composed, confesses her love with that quiet, devastating honesty. Then Maul drives the Darksaber straight through her. It's precise, theatrical, and cruel, designed so Obi-Wan can't move, can't save her, and has to watch the light leave her eyes while Maul smiles. That precision is exactly why this is our divergence point. What happens if one variable shifts? A deflected angle, delayed death, unexpected rescue, or even Maul choosing to prolong her suffering instead of ending it cleanly. Now, let's get started on how Satine surviving that blade doesn't just deny Maul his revenge, it rewrites Mandalore's fate in the Clone Wars. So our branch point has to be tiny, but surgical. The kind of thing that could actually happen in that throne room without breaking the episode. The change we're going with is this. Maul still ignites the Darksaber, still pulls Satine toward him, and still drives the blade through her torso in front of Obi-Wan. But in that split second, Obi-Wan lunges, and Satine twists, trying to shield him the way she once shielded Mandalore from war. That movement doesn't save her from the strike, it just alters the angle. Instead of a clean heart shot, the Darksaber passes a few centimeters to the side, tearing through lung and major vessels, but missing the heart itself. Maul feels the impact, sees her collapse, and hears her breath hitch. From his perspective, that's more than enough. As I said, his goal is to make Obi-Wan watch her die, not to perform a medical exam. Now, there will be major spoilers for how Star Wars treats injuries, so there's your warning. We've already seen that in this timeline, people survive wild trauma with rapid intervention. Darth Maul is cut in half and lives. Fennec Shand is gut-shot and patched up. Even Anakin survives full-body burns. Mandalore, of course, is not some backwater. It's a core world with advanced tech, new Mandalorian infrastructure, and access to Republic medevac once alarms start flying. Here's where we add the Force element without turning Obi-Wan into a sudden healer. As Maul pulls the blade free, Obi-Wan reaches out in pure instinct. He can't stop the stab, but he can do two small, crucial things. He unconsciously slows the saber's final push, shaving off that last lethal depth, and then he clamps down on Satine's life signs with the same focus he once used to hold himself steady on a tiny tracking droid over Coruscant. He's not healing her, he's just buying minutes. Those minutes matter. While Maul throws Obi-Wan in a cell, Satine is bleeding out but not gone. Bo-Katan's loyalists breach the palace, and in the chaos they drag the Duchess to a medbay. Mandalorian surgeons stabilize her with Bacta, internal sealants, and a fast call to Republic support. We keep it grounded in what we've already seen: clones and Jedi survive when someone gets to them fast enough. What does not change is the emotional core of the scene. Obi-Wan still believes he's watched the woman he loves die in his arms. Maul still walks away, convinced he's shattered Kenobi forever and secured Mandalore. The city is still falling, Death Watch is still splintered, and Maul's criminal empire still tightens its grip. The difference is that, in a hidden operating theater beneath a collapsing capital, a flatline monitor flickers, steadies, and Satine cries is pulled back from the edge. Maul leaves the throne room, certain his revenge is complete, while the Duchess he thought he'd erased is being rushed into a desperate surgery that will decide the entire future of Mandalore. So now we jump straight into the emergency on Sundari, where that flickering flatline turns into a full-on race against time. The throne room is still echoing with Maul's victory speech when Bo-Katan snaps an order, and Satine is ripped out of the spotlight and into the shadows. Her most loyal guards surge forward first, the same royal protectors who were supposed to keep this from ever happening. They slap a portable sealant over the cauterized wound, call in medical droids, and form a moving shield wall as blaster fire starts to erupt through the palace corridors. A battered 2-1B unit and a couple of hovering med droids are literally working on Satine as they run, injecting concentrated Bacta, stabilizing her spine, and fighting to keep her breathing while the capital tears itself apart around them. Now, there will be major spoilers for how bad Sundari can get, so there's your warning. The Undercity is already collapsing into riots as Deathwatch and Maul's forces clash, and Bo-Katan has to think like both a sister and a commander. She routes the convoy away from the main avenues, through half-finished tunnels and old maintenance shafts, toward a secure med bunker built during the old warrior days that Satine never publicly acknowledged even existed. This is where Obi-Wan's dilemma really hits. He's running alongside the stretcher at first, one hand hovering over Satine's shoulder, reaching out through the Force to dull the pain and keep her anchored. He wants to stay. Of course he does. This is the woman he once told, in canon, that he would have left the Jedi Order for. But he's also the only Jedi on Mandalore who has seen Maul's coup firsthand, and can actually get word to the Republic. Bo-Katan lays it out in one brutal sentence. If he stays, Satine might live, but Mandalore dies in silence. If he leaves, there's a chance the Republic fleet comes, Ahsoka comes, someone comes. So now Obi-Wan has to make the most Kenobi choice possible. He promises Satine, barely conscious, that he will return, and that this time he will not abandon Mandalore to its fate. Then he turns away from the operating table and toward a stolen gauntlet fighter, choosing the galaxy over his own heart one more time. As I said, Bo-Katan is doing her own impossible balancing act. She splits her night owls, half to hold choke points against Maul's enforcers, half to lock down the med bunker. For the first time, she's not just fighting for a throne or for the old creed. She's fighting for a living symbol. The thought creeps in that if Satine survives, a pacifist duchess and a hardened warrior could actually present a united Mandalore in a way Pre Vizsla never could. Because of that, Satine's condition becomes the most closely guarded secret on the planet. Officially, the Duchess is dead, her body lost in the chaos. Unofficially, only Bo-Katan, a handful of trusted medics, and Obi-Wan know the truth. The med droids wipe logs, Guards rotate under false orders, and anyone even approaching the bunker without the right code phrase disappears into the dark. Inside, there's no politics, just the raw sound of survival. The surgeons cut away scorched armor weave, thread in synth skin, and try to rebuild what Maul's blade shattered. A monitor starts to climb, then suddenly plunges. Satine flatlines. The room explodes into motion as droids dump more Bacta. A medic shouts for a cardiac stim, and we hold on that shrill, unbroken tone. Did Mandalore's last hope just die on the table? We don't see the answer yet. The screen cuts away on the frozen image of Bo-Katan outside the door, helmet in her hands, as alarms wail beneath a city falling under Maul's control. When we cut back in, Mandalore has changed so much, it's almost unrecognizable. Maul doesn't just sit on a throne in Sundari now, he builds an entire regime on Satine's supposed death. This is where his rule stops being a personal vendetta against Obi-Wan and becomes a full-scale experiment in fear. First, Maul consolidates power the only way someone raised by Sidious and the Night Sisters really would. Death Watch patrols march the streets as armored enforcers, dragging suspected loyalists of the new Mandalorians into public squares. Executions are staged right under the Great Dome, with Maul's criminal syndicates handling the logistics in the background. Black Sun moves weapons, the Pikes move spice and food, and the citizens learn fast that even their rations are controlled by off-world gangsters. The propaganda machine kicks in just as hard. Holo posters show Satine's face next to the shattered glass of the throne room, with slogans about weakness, betrayal, and the cost of pacifism. Maul lets the story spread that she begged for mercy, that she died whimpering, and that Mandalore almost fell because she refused to embrace its warrior roots. As I said, this is Maul rewriting an entire culture's narrative in real time. Now, there will be major spoilers for how Mandalorian politics usually go, so there's your warning. In canon, Satine's death is a tragedy. Here, her death becomes a tool. Maul presents himself as the anti-Satine, strong where she was soft, decisive where she was weak. To the wider galaxy, this sells the image of a hardline strongman restoring order to a once neutral world. To Mandalorians who grew up on tales of Tara Vizsla, it's a twisted return to form. Then the pattern breaks. Quietly, in the Undercity, whispers start. A medic who saw something in the palace infirmary. A Death Watch trooper who swears the body was never cremated. A black market Bacta dealer who suddenly has a very rich, very secretive client. Rumors that Satine survived begin to circulate, and that turns her from a cautionary tale into a living legend. This is where Bo-Katan gets clever. She knows the truth about Satine's condition, and she turns that truth into a recruitment tool. Now, when she pulls old night owls and disillusioned clones of the Super Commando Squad into hidden safe houses, she doesn't just say they are fighting for Mandalore's throne. She says they are fighting for their Duchess's chance to come back and speak for herself. I thought it would be fun to imagine how that changes the coming siege. When Ahsoka eventually drops out of hyperspace over Mandalore, she's not just liberating a world from Maul. She's walking into a haunted planet, one ruled by a ghost everyone thinks is dead, and a resistance built around the dangerous hope that the ghost is still breathing somewhere beneath the palace. Now we shift away from the throne room and into something much quieter, but in some ways much harsher. Mandalore becomes a world of sirens and fire, but Satine's world shrinks to the soft beeping of machines in a forgotten bunker. Bo-Katan does the most un-Mandalorian thing imaginable for a former Death Watch lieutenant. She waits. Satine survives Maul's blade by minutes, not hours. Bo drags her out through secret passages while the palace is still echoing with Maul's speech, and a tiny squad of loyalists rushes her to a hidden facility under Sundari's lower levels. They were never meant to be doctors. They're commandos and pilots improvising as medics. Satine spends weeks in a medically induced coma, chest wrapped in Bacta-soaked mesh, a respirator hissing where her voice used to carry whole parliaments. The timeline outside races forward, but down here, everything is measured in blinking lights and the slow climb of vital signs. Bo-Katan posts night owls at every access point. Two of them joke, in very classic clone fashion, that this is the worst guard duty assignment ever, because their VIP doesn't even talk back. It's a small, bitter echo of those boring meteor shower complaints from the Rishi Outpost episode. But now, the meteor has already hit. Obi-Wan finds her the way he always finds trouble, following whispers in the Force and half-burned intel from the Resistance. Between missions, he slips away from the Jedi Council, from Anakin, from the war itself, and comes to this dark little room. Now, there will be major spoilers for Obi-Wan's emotional stability here, so there's your warning. He sits beside Satine's bed and confesses everything he never said on Mandalore's sunny balconies. He tells her the Council refused to commit fully. He tells her he left her world in the name of a larger war. He tells her Maul used her as a message because Obi-Wan made himself a symbol. As I said, this is where the what-if really starts cutting. Satine's first true awakening isn't dramatic. No gasping, no sudden sit-up. Her fingers twitch around Obi-Wan's hand while he's mid-confession about Anakin already slipping, and her eyes open to the ceiling she doesn't recognize. Recovery is slow. Speech comes in fragments. Walking is a distant goal. But information hits fast. Bo-Katan, trying to be gentle and failing, explains that the new Mandalorian government has collapsed, Maul rules through a puppet, and the city burns in her name. Satine has to face the brutal irony. Her pacifism didn't prevent war, it just left her people disarmed when war came. She hears about Death Watch now fighting Maul's super commandos in the streets, about civilians caught between Sith ambition and Mandalorian pride, and she is stuck in a bed, lungs burning when she tries to sit up. I thought it would be fun to trace Domino Squad's growth once. This is the opposite. This is watching a leader realize her philosophy never got the chance to grow armor. Here we get the core ideological tension. Satine still believes violence corrupts. She still believes Mandalore's old warrior culture nearly destroyed them before. But she can't ignore that Bo-Katan's guns are the only reason this bunker still exists. Every time the facility shakes from distant fighting, she remembers telling the galaxy that Mandalore had moved beyond such things. The galaxy did not agree. Eventually, she asks Bo-Katan for the truth without filters. How many dead? How many children hiding in tunnels? How many warriors turned into enforcers wearing Maul's sigil? Bo doesn't spare her. That honesty hurts more than the wound. The decision Satine reaches is quiet, but it might be the most radical of her life. One evening, with Obi-Wan off-world again and the machines finally removed from her face, she tells Bo-Katan that if she ever walks under Mandalore's sky again, she will not carry a blaster. But she will never again use her office, or her beliefs, to block Mandalore from defending itself. She will argue for restraint, for mercy, for diplomacy, but she will sign the orders that arm the people if she must. Now, let's get started on what that means when Ahsoka's gunships finally break through the clouds. Now, there will be major spoilers for how these sisters treat Mandalore's soul as a battlefield, not just a planet, so there's your warning. When Ahsoka's gunships cut through the clouds, we don't just have clones and gunships dropping into a war zone. We have Satine and Bo-Katan, two halves of Mandalore's identity, forced back into the same room. In canon, their divide is brutal. Bo-Katan walked away from Satine's pacifism, joined Death Watch, and helped Pre Vizsla drag Mandalore back toward the old warrior creed. She believed that if Mandalore stopped being a warrior world, it would stop existing at all. Now, that history doesn't vanish just because Maul is the common enemy. When they finally meet again in this timeline, it's not a warm embrace. Satine is still weak from her near death, wrapped in that dignitary's calm. Bo-Katan is in armor, helmet under her arm, carbon scoring on the plates. They were sisters, but they stand there like opposing factions. Bo-Katan breaks the silence first. She admits Satine was right about one thing. Bringing in an outsider warlord like Maul was a betrayal of everything Mandalorian, and it poisoned Death Watch from the inside. But then she hits back. She tells Satine that without an armed resistance, Maul would rule forever. The clones will leave. The Jedi will move on. Only Mandalorians with blasters and Beskar will still be here when the dust settles. That's her core belief, and she doesn't apologize for it. Satine has to swallow some very hard lessons. As I said earlier, in canon she disarmed Mandalore so thoroughly that Deathwatch and Maul could carve it up with almost no organized resistance. Here, she admits that was a mistake. She tells Bo-Katan that peace without the means to defend it is just a ceasefire waiting to be broken. But she also warns her, if they simply trade Maul's rule for a new warrior strongman, even a Mandalorian one, they'll just repaint the throne and keep the same cycle. This leads to a fragile, almost uncomfortable compromise. I thought it would be fun to really sit in that tension. Satine quietly agrees to support Bo-Katan's resistance. She'll coordinate with Ahsoka, open safe houses, move supplies, even sign off on arming certain loyalist squads. She calls it a necessary evil. In return, Bo-Katan promises that any future Mandalore she fights for will protect civilians, keep a council, hold real elections, and never again turn cities into target ranges. And then Satine asks the question that freezes Bo-Katan more than any blaster bolt. When Mandalore wins, will this be the rebirth of Satine's Mandalore, or a new warrior empire with Bo-Katan's face on the recruitment posters? Now, let's get started on what happens when the battle forces them to answer that in real time. That question on Mandalore isn't just haunting Bo-Katan, it's echoing all the way to the Jedi Temple. Because the moment Satine is stabilized and hidden away in that secure facility outside Sundari, Obi-Wan does what Obi-Wan always does. He reports to the Council. Now, there will be major spoilers for the late Clone Wars era, so there's your warning. Obi-Wan stands in the Council chamber, robe still scorched from Mandalore, and calmly explains that Satine Kryze is alive, in critical condition, and that Maul believes he finished the job. Yoda, Plo Koon, and the others make a decision that feels cold, but very Jedi. They classify her survival at the highest level. Officially, to the galaxy, to Maul, even to most clones, Satine died on Mandalore that day. The logic is brutal, but clear. If Maul learns she survived, he returns, he escalates, and Mandalore becomes an obsession instead of just a trophy. By letting the story of her death stand, the Council turns Satine herself into a kind of strategic ghost, a hidden piece on the board they can move later. As I said, this is the era where every choice is about the endgame. And that endgame is exactly why they start thinking of Satine as more than Obi-Wan's lost love. In their private sessions, Yoda and Mace talk about the Outer Rim after the war. Systems like Mandalore, Onderon, and Ryloth are going to be fragile, full of warlords and ex-separatists. A living Satine Kryze, already a known pacifist leader who once disarmed an entire warrior culture, suddenly looks like a perfect stabilizing anchor in that region if the Republic wins. She can be the counterweight to chaos that the Jedi themselves will be too depleted to provide. Of course, that strategic value collides head-on with Obi-Wan's personal stake. He pushes hard for more aid to Mandalore, medical teams, security detachments, even a permanent Jedi presence to protect Satine's recovery. But the Council is watching Coruscant, sensing Sidious without knowing his name, and tracking Anakin's growing instability. Resources are thin. Clones are dying on a dozen fronts. Mandalore, in the official war timeline, is important but not existential. This is where the quiet tension creeps in. Some masters, especially the more rigid ones, start to wonder in hushed side conversations whether Obi-Wan's attachment is clouding his judgment. They remember his history with Satine. They see him volunteering for every Mandalorian-related briefing. It's a soft parallel to their blind spot with Anakin and Padme. They can sense something is off, but they convince themselves it's under control. Pattern interrupt here. The one who sees the furthest isn't suspicious of Obi-Wan at all. It's Yoda, closing his eyes in meditation and glimpsing Mandalore intertwined with the path of a former Jedi. He can't see her face clearly, but we know it's Ahsoka Tano. So, there's your warning for where this is heading. The Council's classified file on Satine and Yoda's cryptic sense of another are what will eventually justify calling Ahsoka back into the fight. setting the stage for a very different siege of Mandalore than the one we saw on screen. I thought it would be fun to follow that thread next and see how Ahsoka's arrival changes when Satine is still breathing. Now, let's get started by snapping back to the canon timeline for a second, because the countdown to the Siege of Mandalore is already ticking. While Satine is hidden away and recovering, Maul is spiraling. On Mandalore, he's sitting on a stolen throne, haunted by visions of Sidious's grand design, sensing that the Clone Wars are reaching a point where even he is just another pawn. That paranoia is what makes him cling to Mandalore so hard. At the same time, Ahsoka has walked away from the Jedi Order. She's out on her own, helping people in the lower levels of Coruscant, trying to figure out who she is without the Temple, the Council, and of course without Anakin as her general. In canon, Bo-Katan tracks her down and convinces her to help retake Mandalore from Maul. Here, that outreach starts a little earlier, and it has someone else's fingerprints all over it. As I said, Satine is not just lying in a bed waiting for the plot to happen. From her secure medical hideout, she's getting fragmented intel about Maul's behavior, about Sidious, and about the Republic's increasingly harsh tactics. She pushes Bo-Katan in a very specific direction. Don't go to the Council. Go to the one Jedi who isn't a Jedi anymore. Satine believes that an ex-Jedi, someone who has seen the flaws of the Order up close, will be more flexible, more willing to fight for Mandalore without turning it into another military occupation. So when Bo-Katan and her Night Owls finally corner Ahsoka on Coruscant, the pitch is different from the episode we know. Bo doesn't just say, "We need your help to capture Maul." She adds a classified detail. The Duchess you watched die is alive. Bo-Katan lays it out in a cramped gunship briefing, engines roaring, telling Ahsoka that Satine survived Maul's blade, but is too weak and politically radioactive to reveal. If Mandalore falls again, Satine dies for real. That's the leverage. Now, there will be major spoilers for Ahsoka's emotional state here, so there's your warning. Ahsoka is stunned. She replays that throne room, Obi-Wan's restraint, his refusal to kill Maul in anger. Suddenly, it makes a different kind of sense. His mercy didn't just honor the Jedi Code. In this timeline, it accidentally saved Satine's life. Ahsoka feels that same old weight she carried for her clones on Umbara and on Ryloth, but now it's tied to a hidden Duchess and an entire planet on the brink. By the time their gunship punches into hyperspace, a three-part strategy is forming. Satine, propped up with monitors beeping in the background, quietly drafts terms for a post-Maul government that can survive the storm she feels coming. Bo-Katan coordinates loyalist squads and prepares a trap to box Maul in, rather than just drive him off. And Ahsoka, staring at the swirling tunnel of hyperspace, starts planning for something the others can't see yet: what happens when the clones turn. I thought it would be fun to end this stretch, right where all three plans intersect, with one question hanging over them. Can they use Maul as bait, not just to free Mandalore, but to outmaneuver the invisible order that will soon command every clone in the galaxy? Now, let's get started right where that planning pays off. The gunships drop out of hyperspace over Sundari, and the Siege of Mandalore still opens with one of the coolest visuals in the whole Clone Wars timeline. Layat gunships burn through the clouds, Mandalorian gauntlet fighters peel off into the upper atmosphere, and below them, Maul's loyalists scramble in those jagged, crimson-marked helmets that tell us this is not Satine's city anymore. On the ground, it's familiar and completely different at the same time. Ahsoka rides a gunship down with a squad of 303nd troopers, their helmets painted in her Togruta markings, and they were ready to jump straight into Maul's trap. But as I said, there's a second set of orders woven into Rex's briefing. Capture Maul, of course, but also lock down power relays, the comms nexus, and the civic archives, so that when the fighting dies down, there's actually a functioning capital for a Duchess the galaxy thinks is dead. So while Bo-Katan's Night Owls slam into Maul's super commandos in midair, we watch Ahsoka land on those glass walkways with a slightly different urgency. Every intersection they clear, every shield gate they slice open, is one more piece of infrastructure they need intact if they're going to bring Satine out of hiding. It's not just a battle for streets. It's a battle for hospitals, data cores, even food distribution hubs. All the boring things Satine used to give speeches about that suddenly matter more than ever. Cut away from the chaos, and we see why. Satine, still healing and still Mandalorian stubborn, sits in a secure bunker with a small staff and a single holo recorder. While the clones and night owls fight above, she drafts emergency laws on a datapad, records quiet addresses to the people of Mandalore, and outlines a transitional council that includes both pacifists and warriors. I thought it would be fun to echo those old Obi-Wan lines here, with her pausing mid-speech and muttering, "Negotiation is our most powerful weapon," before steeling herself and authorizing defensive measures she would have rejected in the first year of the war. Now, there will be major spoilers for the emotional side of this assault, because those orange-helmed clones are charging through blaster fire, believing they're honoring Ahsoka alone. They don't know that the crest on some of Bo-Katan's armor now doubles as a quiet symbol for a living Duchess. They don't know that when they secure the government quarter, they're making room for a leader whose death was a Holonet headline. Up in the shattered throne room, Maul feels it. The resistance is too coordinated, too careful with the city's arteries. He paces, snarling that the puppets dance to a new tune, and for the first time, he wonders if the trophy he showed Kenobi on that broadcast was as final as he wanted to believe. And that suspicion is going to change how he fights this siege. That tiny suspicion Maul feels in the throne room doesn't stay tiny for long. Down in the Undercity, Bo-Katan's people route their comms through half-broken civilian towers, and that's where Maul's spies get lucky. A garbled encrypted burst slips through, full of Mandalorian codes and one phrase that should be impossible: "Protect the Duchess." Now, let's get started with how he actually pieces this together. Maul drags in a captured Night Owl commander, armor scorched, helmet ripped away. He toys with her at first, treating the interrogation as just another distraction from the clones closing in. But when she spits, "You'll never find her," Maul pauses. Her eyes widen at her own words. That's the slip. He leans in, voice dropping to that cold whisper we know. Her, "Who?" And she breaks, not from pain, but from the horror of realizing Satine Kryze is still leverage. At first, Maul rejects it. Satine was supposed to be a completed act, a finished episode in his revenge timeline. He replayed that moment with Obi-Wan over and over, the way he forced Kenobi to watch. Now, there will be major spoilers for Maul's ego, so there's your warning. Because when he orders his slicers to trace that transmission, and the answer comes back connected to old New Mandalorian medical routes, the denial cracks. His breathing changes. The throne room trembles. The psychological victory he built his whole Mandalore plan on, it wasn't real. Then the rage hits. Not just anger at Satine's survival, but at the idea that Obi-Wan has been carrying a secret Maul didn't get to script. As I said, Maul's whole thing is control. So he flips the board. He pulls Mandalorians off key choke points, abandons carefully fortified intersections, and diverts entire squads from holding the city to sweeping for hidden clinics, old government bunkers, anywhere a pacifist Duchess might be stashed. The siege stops being a clean military operation and turns into a manhunt. Of course, that chaos doesn't go unnoticed. Ahsoka is already juggling being a non-Jedi commander, working with clones who technically answer to the Republic, and Mandalorians who definitely don't. When Rex reports that Maul's forces are ignoring strategic positions just to hit suspected refugee corridors, Ahsoka puts it together fast. Satine isn't just a symbol now. She's the prize in a race between liberation and assassination. I thought it would be fun to show how that forces Ahsoka to split her focus. She has to carve off clones to reinforce Bo-Katan's escort routes, keep Satine moving, and still push toward the throne room to capture Maul before Order 66 reshapes everything. It's the classic protect the VIP and take the boss mission. But the VIP is a woman Obi-Wan once joked could argue a Jedi Council into submission, and the boss is listening, because Maul feels her through the Force now, a faint echo threaded through Obi-Wan's old attachment. He reaches out, not to Satine, but to Ahsoka. In the middle of a firefight, she freezes for half a second as his voice slithers into her mind. "Tell Kenobi I will correct my mistake. This time, the Duchess will die slowly enough for him to feel every second, if he lives long enough to hear of it." And as Ahsoka snaps back to the battle, realizing Maul is hunting Satine in real time, we're set up for a confrontation where every corridor on Mandalore suddenly matters. That line from Maul turns every alley and ventilation shaft into a countdown. And as his forces start triangulating Satine's little underground refuge, we hit the real turning point of this alternate siege. Bo-Katan wants to move Satine deeper into the tunnels, keep her hidden, keep the fight clean and tactical. But Satine, still pale from Maul's blade and propped up on a makeshift med cot, refuses. She insists on being moved into the open, arguing that Mandalore needs to see her alive more than she needs safety. As I said, this is the same woman who stared down Death Watch gunships with nothing but a speech and a spine of Beskar. So, there's your warning. This is where pacifism stops being abstract philosophy and becomes a weapon. Bo-Katan grits her teeth, but she listens. They reroute power from weapons to comms, drag a holorig into a half-ruined plaza, and literally wheel Satine out under a flickering dome of shields. The city's emergency broadcast grid, which Maul's been using for propaganda, suddenly glitches. Pattern interrupt. Instead of the horned silhouette on every screen, we get a shaky image of the Duchess, wounded but upright. Now, let's get started with the broadcast itself. Satine's voice is softer than we remember from the Clone Wars, but it carries. She calls Maul what he is, an off-world usurper who murdered her government and tried to turn Mandalorians back into hired blades. She names Bo-Katan on air as the commander of the liberation effort and tells the clans that honoring Mandalorian strength does not mean kneeling to a Sith. She even quotes that old line to Obi-Wan, "You're a good man," and turns it outward, asking her people to be better than their fear. The effect hits fast. Death Watch rank and file, those blue-helmeted clones of the old warrior culture, hesitate in the streets. Some lower their weapons at civilians. Others tear off Maul's red sigil right there on the battlefield. Civilians pour out of their homes, not with blasters, but with banners and recorded messages, clogging the avenues Maul needs clear for his troops. It's not a military victory yet, but it is a morale landslide. In parallel, Ahsoka is still dueling Maul in the rafters and shipyards, just like in the original episode. Only now, Maul fights with this wild, desperate fury, because as Satine's image spreads through every holoscreen, his leverage is evaporating. He screams that they were all born for war, that peace is a lie, but the city below is literally proving him wrong in real time. Eventually, the ending lines up with canon. Ahsoka still brings him down, the clones still capture him, the cruiser still looms overhead, but Mandalore does not emerge leaderless. When the guns fall silent, there is a living Duchess ready to legitimize Bo-Katan's military victory and start rebuilding, and that changes what Order 66 is about to destroy. Now, there will be major spoilers for that part of the timeline, so we'll push into that in the next section. So now we hit the moment where the timeline really bends. Mandalore isn't just a battlefield that Ahsoka passes through. It suddenly becomes a functioning government again, right on the edge of the Republic's collapse. In the immediate aftermath of the siege, Satine is officially reinstated as Duchess. The holo feeds that Maul once used to broadcast his takeover now carry a different image. Satine standing beside Bo-Katan, announcing that the Kryze line has returned and that Death Watch's blades are being turned into a formal planetary defense. Bo-Katan is recognized as her military commander, almost a Mandalorian general, while Ahsoka prepares to depart with Maul sealed in that ray-shielded box, escorted up to the waiting cruiser. They were all exhausted, but there's this fragile sense that, for once, Mandalore got a win. Satine's first decrees show how different this victory is. She authorizes a partial rearmament of Mandalore, but under strict civilian oversight. No more secret camps, no more hidden rockets. Every rifle is registered to a district, every starfighter logged by the Council. She signs legal protections for non-combatants into law, explicitly banning the kind of terror tactics Death Watch used in the series. And then she makes the big pledge. Mandalore will remain independent from both Republic and Separatists. As I said, she's not going to trade one occupation for another. In an echo of, "I will not be provoked into war," she now says, "We will not be bought into war either." Of course, there's someone watching all of this who is very much not amused. From Sidious's perspective, this is a problem. He now sees Mandalore as a semi-neutral, semi-armed world led by a charismatic pacifist who has already resisted his apprentice twice. Maul failed to break her, Death Watch failed to replace her. And now this Duchess is stabilizing a key Outer Rim sector right as he's about to burn the old order down. That is not on the script for his new empire. I thought it would be fun to really sit with that for a second. Palpatine has spent years making sure every major power is either dependent on the Republic or openly part of the Separatists. Mandalore, under Satine, is neither. It's a third option. And if there's one thing the Sith hate, it's a third option. Now, there will be major spoilers for the end of the Clone Wars, so there's your warning. As Anakin falls, as the clone's inhibitor chips are triggered, Satine's new Mandalore is about to be caught between a dying Republic and a rising Empire. Picture the crosscut. On Coruscant, Palpatine calmly signs Order 66. On Sundari, Satine signs a law limiting military power and reaffirming civilian control. Two pens, two empires, one galaxy about to be remade in fire. Now, let's get started on what happens when those orders collide. Those orders collide almost instantly. While Satine is signing away emergency powers on Sundari, on a Star Destroyer above, Ahsoka is fighting for her life as Order 66 detonates the entire clone chain of command. I thought it would be fun to really sit with that crosscut, because it shows how fast Mandalore loses the one Jedi ally who actually understands them. We follow Ahsoka and Rex through that crashing Venator, Maul tearing through clones in the corridors, the hangar ripping apart. In canon, this is already one of the most intense sequences in the show. Here, it hits even harder, because every clone that dies is another bridge Satine can't use, another voice that could have vouched for her in the new regime. Ahsoka escapes into the wider galaxy, Rex goes underground, and Maul just vanishes into the shadows. Mandalore wakes up the next day with no Jedi, no formal Republic garrison, and no idea why their clone allies suddenly turned on their generals. News of the Jedi Purge reaches Sundari in fragments. Holonet reports talk about treason, a failed coup, and of course, Palpatine's calm declaration of a new galactic empire. Satine watches that speech in the same throne room where Maul once tried to break her, and she does the opposite of what the galaxy expects. She refuses to recognize the change. Publicly, she condemns the Jedi extermination as a crime, and calls the rebranding of the Republic illegal. So, there's your warning. Satine is not going to quietly slide into being an imperial satrap. Now, as I said, the Empire is smart enough not to repeat Death Watch's mistake with a loud invasion right away. Their first move is pressure. Trade lanes into Mandalorian space suddenly get restructured. Supply convoys are delayed by security inspections. A Republic relief contract for post-siege reconstruction is quietly cancelled. At the same time, Imperial intelligence starts slipping credits and weapons to hardline Mandalorian clans who always thought Satine's pacifism was a betrayal. Where Death Watch once said, "The strong survive," the Empire now whispers, "The strong get Imperial backing." That creates a brutal internal split. Some Mandalorians argue that open defiance will just invite another Sundari bombardment, this time from Star Destroyers instead of Maul's blockade. Others, especially younger warriors who grew up hearing stories about Tara Vizsla and "This is the way," want to preemptively hit Imperial depots, shipyards, anything with an Imperial crest. Satine is pulled between appeasement and open rebellion, trying to thread a path where Mandalore can stay neutral without becoming a vassal. Now there will be major spoilers for where this timeline goes, so we'll hold back the full fallout, but the tension crystallizes in one moment. An Imperial envoy arrives in Sundari, polished armor, crisp uniform, a smile that never reaches his eyes. He offers protection for Mandalore's reconstruction and partnership in securing the Outer Rim, all in exchange for a permanent Imperial presence. On the balcony above the plaza, Satine listens, the crowd murmurs, and the clones in the audience are gone. In their place stand Imperial stormtrooper prototypes, helmets gleaming. She has to answer him, and what she says next will decide whether Mandalore becomes another conquered world or the first real crack in the Empire. Now, let's get started on that choice. So, Satine doesn't answer the Moff's speech with a dramatic refusal or a heroic declaration. She does something much more dangerous for the Empire. She tells him to sit down. The first negotiations take place right there in the throne room of Sundari. Now, there will be major spoilers for how Mandalore normally goes under Imperial control, so there's your warning. In this timeline, Satine walks down from the balcony, cloak trailing, and insists on one thing before anyone talks about fleets or credits. Mandalore is sovereign. Full stop. From that starting point, she offers only what she can live with: limited trade access, shared anti-piracy patrols on the outer routes, and information exchanges on separatist remnants. The envoy smiles that Imperial smile we've seen 100 times. On paper, he accepts her framing. In practice, the demands he puts forward would gut it. The Empire wants permanent garrisons on key moons and mining worlds, temporary listening posts along Mandalorian hyperspace lanes, and of course, regulatory authority over all Beskar exports. On top of that, they request the right to assist in internal security, which is a very polite way of saying, we station our people in your prisons and your streets until you are a client state in everything but name. Satine listens to every point, but she starts drawing red lines fast. No Imperial base inside Sundari's dome. No foreign officers embedded in the new Mandalorian Guard. No external court over Mandalorian law. As I said, she has bent before, but she will not let the Empire write her people's future. The only thing she concedes is joint patrols in already contested space, and even those must fly under Mandalorian command codes. Of course, that's not what the envoy actually reports back to Coruscant. In private, on a secure channel, he tells his superiors that Satine Kryze is a problem. She's too principled to sign away real control, too popular to be toppled cleanly, and too visible as the woman who survived Maul to simply disappear. Palpatine's circle does what they always do. They start drafting a stabilization initiative, engineered unrest, a Death Watch remnant suddenly armed with suspiciously fresh Imperial hardware, and a pre-written invitation for the Empire to restore order. Here's the pattern interrupt. Satine reads the draft treaty, listens to the envoy, and signs. Not the whole thing, but a temporary, heavily limited agreement with review clauses, sunset dates, and enough legal tripwires to make any Coruscant lawyer groan. On the surface, Mandalore accepts a sliver of Imperial presence. Underneath, Satine is already meeting with Bo-Katan, rearming quiet loyalists, and turning every concession into time. Time to prepare for the worst that she now knows is coming. Now, let's get started on how long that clock actually runs before it hits zero. That clock doesn't just tick in the background of canon Mandalore. In The Mandalorian, it's already gone off. We're told about the Great Purge, the Night of 1,000 Tears, the glassed surface, the scattered covert clans hoarding scraps of Beskar, and stories of the Way. Now there will be major spoilers for that era and for what we're changing here, so there's your warning. In this timeline, Satine hears those future echoes long before the first bomb falls. She studies every Imperial move through the lens of worlds that were, of course, pacified before Mandalore. Geonosis stripped, Ryloth strangled, Lasan annihilated. So she does something her detractors never expected. She quietly plans for war, not to win it in glorious battles, but to survive it. Critical power relays are broken up and hidden in deep caverns. Food production is decentralized to remote domes. Medical facilities are duplicated in underground disaster clinics, that officially don't exist. The culture is what she protects most fiercely. As I said, Satine's whole reputation is built on pacifism, but here she's organizing the most Mandalorian heist squad you can imagine, and the prize isn't credits, it's identity. Beskar caches are cataloged and slowly moved off-world under the cover of trade convoys. Ancient armor, songs, holo recordings, the designs for the Night Owl helmets, and even old Deathwatch banners are quietly shipped to trusted enclaves on Concordia, Kalevala, and a few systems that will eventually look a lot like those hidden children of the Watch Coves we see in The Mandalorian. Of course, the Empire does not leave that kind of quiet preparation alone. Imperial advisors arrive as security consultants, and they start doing what the Empire does best, turning Mandalorians against each other. They arm the loudest traditionalists, whispering that Satine is selling their warrior birthright to Coruscant, that she's trading Beskar for Senate favor. Those extremists start drilling in old armor, quoting "only the strong shall rule," while holding E-11s fresh from Imperial depots. It's Deathwatch energy, but now with Imperial logistics behind it. That's where the rift with Bo-Katan really explodes. Bo sees those same weapons and wants to point them outward, hit the Imperial depots first, sabotage the new listening posts, make Mandalore too expensive to occupy. Satine's terrified that the moment a Mandalorian squad blows up a Star Destroyer's fuel line, Palpatine gets the excuse he's been waiting for to turn Mandalore into another cautionary tale. They were sisters in canon conflict. Here, every argument feels like a council session, where one vote could decide if Mandalore becomes Alderaan with jetpacks. The pattern interrupt comes when the joint exercises begin. Star Destroyers start massing in Mandalorian space, neatly scheduled, all with proper paperwork. Training drills, fleet coordination, nothing to worry about. But from the royal balcony, Satine watches the third, then the fourth wedge-shaped shadow slide over Sundari's sky, and realizes something horrible. The purge she's been planning to prevent may already be in motion. Now, let's get started on what she does when the first turbolasers finally turn inward. The first turbolasers don't hit a military base. They walk straight across Sundari's horizon. Fire lances down from Star Destroyers. TIE bombers scream over the glass domes. And for a second, it's almost that meteor shower joke from the Rishi Moon episode. Then the first dome plate vaporizes and the city shakes. This is not a raid. This is the Empire deciding Mandalore will never be a problem again. Now, there will be major spoilers for the Great Purge as we're rewriting it, so there's your warning. In this timeline, they were ready. Satine has evacuation protocols, underground shelters, and hardened bunkers for archives and children. But orbital bombardment laughs at pacifist city planning. Turbolasers chew into the shield grid, shockwaves rattle the throne room, and reports come in all at once. Kalevala burning, Concordia under assault, Night Owl positions pinned by walkers. Satine's staff wants her in the deepest bunker. The Imperial message is clear. Submit to Imperial rule and disarmament, or be pacified. As I said, she has spent years insisting Mandalore can survive by refusing to play the warrior game. Now the game has come to her front door with ATST feet. Here's the dilemma. If she stays in Sundari, standing on the balcony as the Duchess who never bends, she becomes a symbol, the last pacifist of Mandalore, killed by the Empire. That martyr story writes itself. But if she leaves, if she boards a ship while her people are under fire, does she become the coward Satine her enemies always accused her of being? She has to choose in minutes, with the sky literally falling. Bo-Katan storms into the command center wearing scorched armor and half a pauldron. She's already been fighting TIE strafing runs in the streets. Bo doesn't mince words. Mandalore needs its Duchess alive more than it needs a statue. She tells Satine, point blank, that dead leaders can't argue with history, can't rally exiles, can't make the Empire regret this day. She and her squad will hold the line. Satine's job is to make sure there's still a Mandalore to come home to. I thought it would be fun to lean into their old argument here, flipped on its head. The warrior is the one insisting on a strategic retreat. The pacifist is the one who wants to stay and fight. Eventually, Satine realizes that preserving Mandalorian culture might mean abandoning Mandalorian soil. So she does the unthinkable. She walks past the throne, past the balcony where she once welcomed Jedi and senators, and into a crowded hangar full of shuttles. Civilians, scholars, foundlings, children clutching training helmets from the academy. This is the future of Mandalore now. Satine boards with a small council, but before departure, she opens a planet-wide transmission. Her final message is not a call to charge the enemy, it's a call to endure. She urges every Mandalorian to survive, scatter if they must, hide their armor if they have to, but never forget who they are. We are more than a planet, she says. We are a people. Remember that, and they can never truly conquer us. Of course, that line is going to echo later in The Squad of Exiles will follow. The shuttle lifts off as another wave of bombers tears through the city. From the viewport, we see Sundari's dome spiderweb with cracks, atmosphere venting and glittering streams. Bo-Katan's voice comes over the comm, giving coordinates, promising to punch a hole for the next convoy. Then there's a scream of interference, half a sentence. Satine, pull back, they're flanking from the... And the line goes dead. Satine's eyes stay on the dying city as the stars stretch. The ship jumps to hyperspace, leaving Mandalore behind. And we have no idea if Bo-Katan is still alive when they come out the other side. When the stars snap back into real space, Satine is still staring at the place where Mandalore used to be in the viewport. That's the gut punch of this part of the timeline. She's the Duchess of a people with no capital, no throne room, and no idea where the next safe port is. Now let's get started with the refugee fleet itself, because this thing is a mess in the most Star Wars way. They were limping gunships with patched hulls, old gauntlet fighters running escort, civilian transport stuffed with children, and even a few Death Watch craft that peeled off from Maul at the last second. New Mandalorians in pale robes are crammed into corridors next to scarred traditionalists still wearing painted armor, shoulder to shoulder in mess lines, muttering old clan names under their breath. As I said, Satine's first job is just keeping them all from killing each other before the Empire can. She walks hangar decks where Vizsla loyalists glare at pacifist doctors, and she insists on using the same 3 words to everyone. You are Mandalorian. She starts daily holo broadcasts teaching language and history, quoting old warriors and reformers in the same breath. One episode she's reciting the Rissul Nar, another she's explaining why the old palace gardens mattered. She's no longer a planetary ruler, she's a cultural and moral anchor. And her pacifism evolves in a really specific way now. Satine has seen what refusing to fight at all led to, so she authorizes defensive cells on every major ship. She tells them, in almost Obi-Wan fashion, that their armor is not for conquest, but for protection. Guerrilla tactics are on the table, but revenge raids and warlordism are not. A Mandalorian strike team can ambush an Imperial patrol to save a village. They do not burn a world because Maul burned Sundari. Eventually, that discipline gets noticed. Quiet rebel couriers start appearing in shadowy cargo bays. Bail Organa sends a carefully worded message about shared values and mutual defense. Mon Mothma asks for her assessment of hyperspace routes through the Outer Rim and whether her squad of scattered clans could provide trained fighters. I thought it would be fun to imagine Satine watching early rebel cells argue over tactics and saying, "At least our family feuds had helmets." Now, there will be major spoilers for the usual rebel origin story, so there's your warning. This is where we'd expect her to sign on the dotted line and become a founding general. She doesn't. Pattern interrupt. Satine refuses. She tells Bail that Mandalorians cannot just trade one war for another until they know who they are without a homeworld or a warlord. Until they solve that, she says, they're just mercenaries with better speeches. And that choice sets up a very different next move for both the rebellion and Mandalore's scattered children. Now, let's get started on what that choice really means for Obi-Wan. In canon, his timeline after Mandalore is just loss stacked on loss. He watches Satine die in his arms, he fails to save Anakin on Mustafar, and then the Jedi Order is wiped out almost overnight. By the time he reaches Tatooine, he's a man who's lost his squad, his family, and the woman he loved. The desert matches his grief. Here, that's different. Satine doesn't become another name on the long list of the dead. Obi-Wan leaves Mandalore knowing she survived, that she's out there somewhere keeping a fire lit for her people. As I said earlier, that single change means his exile is not a self-imposed tomb. It's a posting. It's still hard, of course, but it's a mission, not a slow surrender. Now, there will be major spoilers for Obi-Wan's emotional state post-Order 66, so there's your warning. Even in this version, he still goes to Tatooine. Protecting Luke is non-negotiable. That part of the timeline is too important to break. The twist is that Satine is the one who insists on it. In their last in-person conversation before the fall of the Republic, I thought it would be fun to have her quote her old line back at him. "If you had stayed, I would have been a different woman." Then she adds, "If you stay now, Luke and Leia will be different people. Go. I'll manage Mandalore." So Obi-Wan becomes the hermit of the Dune Sea, but he's a hermit with a lifeline. Over the years, they trade rare, encrypted messages through trusted rebel relays and old Mandalorian codes. One episode of his life might be him hiking out beyond the Lars homestead to a half-buried transmitter, listening to a distorted recording of Satine describing scattered Mandalorian clans, a failed raid on an Imperial depot, or a quiet victory where they evacuate refugees before the TIEs arrive. Their messages are not long, and they're never quite enough. They talk about the rebellion in broad strokes, about children growing up under the Empire, about how the Jedi and the new Mandalorians both tried to end war and still bred more soldiers. They trade little jokes to keep it from hurting too much. Obi-Wan repeats, "So uncivilized," about an Imperial officer. Satine deadpans that Mandalorians have been saying that about jetpacks for centuries. Emotionally, that contact changes everything. In canon, Obi-Wan on Tatooine feels almost frozen in place, waiting for a boy to grow up. Here, each message from Satine is a reminder that the galaxy is still moving, still worth saving. His solitude becomes bittersweet endurance instead of total despair. He hasn't lost everyone. One person who believed in him still believes, and her example keeps his own hope from drying out in the twin suns. Picture the hook for this era, an older Obi-Wan standing on a dune at sunset, watching Luke race a skyhopper through Beggar's Canyon, and pausing as the Force brushes against him. Somewhere, far away, Satine is still alive, still fighting in her own way. Two exiles under different skies, holding the line until the next generation is ready to step into the light. Now, let's get started with what Satine is actually doing while Obi-Wan is staring out at those twin suns. The Empire rises, Mandalore is shattered by the Purge, and Satine spends years in the shadows, not as a queen on a throne, but as a caretaker of scattered clans and shell-shocked refugees. Her palace is now a half-buried complex on some outer rim rock, more field hospital than royal court. They were broken, but not gone. Satine's first focus is survival. Food convoys through half-charted routes, safe houses run by former New Mandalorian officials, quiet deals with smugglers who remember the Clone Wars. As I said, she's not leading glorious charges. She's teaching farmers how to hide weapons under irrigation systems and drilling into every council meeting the same line. We will not become what we fought. Eventually, the rebellion finds her. Or really, she lets them find her. A young Senator Organa reaches out through trusted channels, offering ships and credits in exchange for coordination. Now, there will be major spoilers for how the early Rebel network grows, so there's your warning. What we're doing is plugging Satine directly into that loose web of cells in the Outer Rim, turning Mandalorian stubbornness into a strategic asset instead of just isolated resistance. Her role is never to be a battlefield commander. She becomes the person in the room who understands that blasters and starfighters are only half the fight. Satine sits in smoky briefings on Yavin, on Chandrila, on nameless freighters, explaining to Rebel firebrands how you win hearts and minds in systems that watch the Jedi fail and the Republic collapse. She tells them, episode after episode in this timeline, that if the rebellion starts treating frontier worlds as expendable pawns, the Empire has already won. From there, her contributions start to stack up. She quietly opens safe routes through Mandalorian space, old trade lanes, and forgotten Concordian corridors that Imperial charts have written off. Rebel convoys vanish into cursed sectors and emerge stocked and refueled. Covert training camps appear on airless moons, where Mandalorian veterans teach rebel commandos how to fight in armor, how to breach starships, how to move as a squad. In return, Satine insists on cultural exchanges. Alderaanian medics in Beskar villages, Twi'lek organizers sitting in Mandalorian council circles, stories traded instead of just credits and gear. Of course, this creates tension. Some rebel leaders look at Mandalorians and see the perfect shock troops. They want them on the front line of every assault, the hammer that smashes Imperial garrisons. Satine pushes back hard. She refuses to let her people be reduced to mercenaries for someone else's war, repeating that Mandalore will fight with the rebellion, not for it. There are shouting matches, walkouts, even one memorable argument where a hot-headed commander mutters, "I thought it would be fun to have an army of Boba Fett's," and Satine just stares at him until he apologizes. All of that conviction is put to the test when a proposal hits her desk. A high-risk operation on an Imperial facility in orbit above Mandalore itself. Symbolic liberation, priceless intel, and projected civilian casualties that make her blood run cold. The room goes quiet as every eye turns to her. Will she greenlight a strike that could free her world, or doom what's left of it? She closes her eyes, hearing echoes of blaster fire in Sundari's halls, and when she opens them, her answer will change the rebellion's path. She opens her eyes and chooses the harder path, not the louder one. Satine authorizes surgical strikes, evacuation corridors, and a brutal set of conditions on any Mandalorian action. No mass bombardment, no easy catharsis. And somewhere out in the dark, the one person who wanted a simple, bloody ending for Mandalore feels that decision like a splinter under the skin. Now, let's get started with Maul in the shadows. In canon, after the siege of Mandalore, Maul is captured by Ahsoka and the clones, locked in that improvised Durasteel sarcophagus. Order 66 hits, chaos erupts on the Venator, and he tears through clones in the corridors to escape. Here, that part of the timeline stays the same. He vanishes back into the criminal underworld, rebuilding his power base through Crimson Dawn and the familiar web of syndicates. The difference is what he can't leave behind. In the original episode, Satine's death is his masterpiece of cruelty, the moment he breaks Obi-Wan and proves that Mandalore is his to ruin. In this version, she survives, and that survival becomes Maul's unfinished sentence. Every report he hears of a Mandalorian exodus, of a pacifist duchess turned rebel stateswoman, is a reminder that his greatest revenge was incomplete. As I said, Maul's whole identity is about control, so he turns the underworld into a knife pointed at Satine's people. We see him directing syndicates to hit refugee convoys, sabotaging supply routes to Mandalorian safe worlds, even staging pirate raids on neutral cells that refuse to bow to the Empire or him. He is not just hunting credits. He is trying to make every survivor of Sundari feel what he felt in that throne room, powerless. And of course, there's another target in his mind. Obi-Wan has vanished into the desert, but Maul knows that Mandalorians were his weakness long before Tatooine, so he leaves clues, whispers, and half-truths in the underworld, hoping word of these attacks will reach Kenobi and drag him out. It's the same obsession we see in Rebels, only now it's tied to a living symbol of his failure. He wanted Satine to be Obi-Wan's wound. Instead, she becomes Maul's. When we finally reach that twin sons duel, the beats are still familiar. Maul arrives, convinced that this old hermit is hiding something, someone. They clash. Kenobi shifts from his old stance to the one he used for Qui-Gon, and the fight ends in a single, perfect stroke. But the meaning of Maul's last moments changes. As he lies there, asking if the Chosen One will avenge them, Kenobi's face softens in a different way. Pattern interrupt here. Instead of any final lesson about victory, Obi-Wan leans closer and adds something we never heard in canon. He tells Maul, quietly, that Satine forgave him long ago. Maul never asked, never wanted that mercy, and he dies with that unresolved grace hanging in the air. His legacy of hate breaks against two people who refuse to answer him with the same weapon. Now, there will be major spoilers for what Satine does with that kind of moral victory, so there's your warning. So now we jump forward in the timeline to Star Wars Rebels, where the Darksaber story really kicks off, and we ask a huge question. What does all of that look like with Satine still alive in exile? In canon, Sabine Wren finds the Darksaber in Maul's creepy Sith hoarder cave on Dathomir, trains with Kanan, and eventually uses it to rally clans like Ren, Vizsla, and Kryze. They were scattered and angry, but that blade, plus Sabine's speech about her family and her guilt, pulls them together. That all leads to Bo-Katan accepting the Darksaber, becoming Mandalore, and Mandalore briefly uniting against the Empire before the Purge turns the planet into glass. Now, let's get started on the Satine version of that same episode run. I thought it would be fun to keep most of Sabine's arc intact, because her growth is too good to lose. She still struggles with what she did at the Imperial Academy, she still doesn't want the responsibility, and she still has that brutal training sequence where Kanan keeps knocking her down. The difference is that when Fen Rao brings up the history of Tara Vizsla, there's another voice in the room, Satine Kryze, older, thinner, living under a false name, but still razor sharp. As I said, Satine becomes the elder stateswoman in the shadows. Hera and Kanan quietly bring Sabine to her, hoping this legendary Duchess can explain what the Darksaber really means. Satine doesn't reach for the hilt. Instead, she tells Sabine she once tried to end the Age of the Blade entirely, and Mandalore nearly tore itself apart around her. The sword won the argument, she might say, echoing Obi-Wan's old line about blasters and civilized ages. Bo-Katan, of course, has a very different take. When Sabine and the Ghost Crew finally bring Satine and Bo-Katan together, it's tense. Bo sees the Darksaber as a banner, the one thing that can cut through clan rivalries and Imperial fear. To her, it's the only way to get warriors to stand in the same direction. Satine warns that the same symbol that once crowned conquerors can just as easily chain them to endless war if they don't redefine it. So they debate what the blade should stand for now. This is where Satine proposes a compromise. Keep the Darksaber, but rewrite the story around it. The oath sworn on it will be vows of protection and unity, not dominance. Swear to defend the weak, to shield Mandalore's children, to never again wage war for sport. Sabine loves this. Bo-Katan tolerates it, because she knows she needs Sabine and the clans. Then we hit the quiet pattern interrupt. When Sabine, overwhelmed, tries to offer the Darksaber to Satine herself, Satine refuses. She tells them Mandalore's future has to belong to those who grew up in war and chose something better, not to the woman who tried to end war and failed. And that decision sets up a very different purge to come. Now, there will be major spoilers for how that purge plays out with Satine's philosophy baked into Mandalore's throne, so there's your warning. Now, let's get started on what all of that means once we hit the original trilogy era, because this is where Satine's survival quietly rewires the whole galactic civil war. The rebellion we know is scrappy and desperate. In this timeline, it's still scrappy and desperate, but it has Mandalorians in the mix who were trained to fight under a pacifist Duchess who hated war and still understood it perfectly. So when the rebel briefing room is planning Scarif, there's a detail that never makes it into the holodramas. Alongside Jin's ground team and the fleet overhead, Satine has authorized small Mandalorian strike squads, veterans of the Purge, to slip through the chaos in stealth-modified gauntlet fighters. They were the ones sabotaging shield relays, planting charges in walker staging areas, and extracting wounded cells that would have been written off as losses. It turns Scarif from a one-way trip into a barely survivable operation, and people whisper that the Mandalore ghosts were there. Those same clans, as I said, don't just vanish between battles. They specialize in covert escorts for rebel convoys. running in the sensor shadows of freighters, spoofing Imperial scans, and jumping in only when raiders or patrols get too close. Out in the Outer Rim, Satine's old diplomatic contacts and Bo-Katan's former Death Watch networks fuse into a serious intelligence web, feeding the Alliance early warnings about Star Destroyer deployments, supply routes, and which Moffs are quietly bleeding their sectors dry. The really big change is that Satine has a voice in high-level strategy. I thought it would be fun to lean into this, because she's the one in the council chambers arguing that victory bought with mass civilian casualties is just a slower kind of defeat. So targets shift. Instead of bombing entire shipyards, Mandalorian commandos infiltrate, sabotage key reactors, and trigger evacuations before detonation. Rebel cells are pushed toward disabling infrastructure and freeing prisoners rather than scorched earth attacks. It keeps the squad leaders from sliding into total war ethics, and it echoes the old clone debates about being soldiers versus just being weapons. Now, Luke and Leia don't necessarily meet Satine on screen in this timeline, but they hear about her. Leia, raised on Alderaan, grows up on stories of the Duchess who stood up to both Death Watch and the Republic and still refused to become a conqueror. Luke hears the name from rebel pilots and from old clone veterans who joke that she was more stubborn than a Camino drill sergeant, just with better outfits. Those stories add a new layer to their understanding of the Force and of leadership. They see that you can be firm, strategic, and still refuse to rule through fear. Of course, the Empire can't let that stand. Imperial propaganda paints Satine as a terrorist mastermind, the hidden hand behind every Mandalorian raid. Holonet specials call her the Shadow Duchess, claiming she's grooming a warrior empire to replace Palpatine. The funny thing is, that smear campaign turns her into a legend on oppressed worlds. If this one woman has resisted since the Clone Wars, then the Empire isn't invincible. Resistance can last decades. And when the second Death Star explodes over Endor, fireworks and wreckage lighting up the sky, Satine is not in the throne room or the war room. She's in a hidden Mandalorian enclave, watching the Imperial codes go dead, listening to half a dozen clans argue over what comes next. The Empire is gone, but the armor is still scarred, the weapons are still loaded, and Satine is already thinking about the power vacuum that's about to swallow the galaxy, and the one person who's moving to fill it that no one in the New Republic is watching yet. The codes die, the Empire falls, and for a second it feels like victory. But in those early New Republic years, it's chaos more than triumph. Power is scattered between provisional councils, old rebel cells, and senators who are already arguing over trade lanes while entire sectors burn. The Outer Rim is treated as background noise, and Mandalore, with its glassed surface and shattered clans, is almost completely off the New Republic's radar. Now, there will be major spoilers for how badly that goes for Mandalorians if Satine does nothing. So, there's your warning. She refuses to let Mandalore become another Alderaan footnote. While Mon Mothma is trying to demilitarize and pull fleets back, Satine is in those same chambers, quietly but relentlessly lobbying. She pushes for aid to Mandalorian refugee convoys, for food and medical support to the scattered protectorates, and most importantly, for formal recognition that Mandalore has the right to rebuild on its own terms, not as a client state politely given one Senate seat and told to be grateful. The New Republic wants a token Mandalorian at the table. Satine wants a people with a voice. She uses every connection from the Clone Wars era, from Obi-Wan's old allies to Bail's former staffers, and she reminds them of something they would rather forget. Republic and Imperial decisions both helped break Mandalore. As I said, that's not a comfortable history lesson for a government trying to brand itself as the heroes of the timeline. Of course, the real storm isn't just in the Senate chambers, it's inside the Mandalorians themselves. Some clans demand an immediate, total return to the homeworld, even if it means walking across radioactive deserts in full armor and fighting each other for underground shelters. Others argue they were forged in exile and should remain a nomadic warrior people, scattered but hard to crush. Satine spends as much time stopping duels between clan champions as she does writing policy briefs. She has to keep reminding them that the enemy is the Empire's legacy, not the Mandalorian in the wrong color paint. Younger leaders complicate this even more. We're now dealing with a generation that never walked Sundari's streets, never heard the pacifist speeches that Death Watch mocked. To them, Satine is half legend, half cautionary tale. They come to her for guidance, but they also ask the question out loud. After the Purge, does pacifism still apply? Satine doesn't give them a holocron answer. She talks about necessary defense, about refusing to become the next Death Watch in shinier armor, and she quotes that old line she used to throw at Obi-Wan, "Fighting always seems to be the easiest answer to you." Now, let's get started on the pattern interrupt in her politics, because this is where she really breaks expectations. Everyone assumes that once the New Republic recognizes Mandalore, she'll demand a massive reconstruction effort, fleets of transports, and a rearmed planetary defense force. Instead, she proposes a phased return. Small, carefully chosen settlements. Cultural and religious sites first. No mass militarization, no rush to rebuild the great domed cities as fortresses. She wants Mandalorians to reclaim their world slowly enough that they don't lose themselves to it again. And that quiet, almost boring plan? That's what sets up the next big conflict, because not everyone in the armor is willing to wait. That slow, almost boring plan to reclaim Mandalore is exactly what makes the jump to Din Djarin's era so interesting. By the time we hit the Mandalorian in this timeline, the surface is still scarred, the cities are still shattered, and the people are still scattered across the Outer Rim. But unlike canon, they also have something the clones never had on Kamino. A living historical figure holding the culture together in exile. In canon, Mandalore is mostly a ghost story by Din's time, a ruined world, and a handful of conflicting legends. Here, Satine's name isn't just in dusty archives. Whole generations grow up hearing, "The Duchess said," in the same breath as, "This is the way." Now let's get started with how that actually filters down. She funds quiet, off-the-books schools in refugee enclaves. She sponsors traveling teachers who move from covert to covert, teaching children Mandoa, history, and that the armor is supposed to protect the innocent first and everything else second. Those lessons don't stay in classrooms. Clan leaders who followed her through the siege of Mandalore eventually blend those ideas with the old warrior codes. So, you get this really fun hybrid. Oaths about honor and battle right alongside stories of Satine refusing to bomb civilian targets, or insisting that victory means your people are still themselves at the end. As I said, Mandalorians love a good story, so these become oral histories traded in mess halls and around campfires the way clones on Umbara traded Krell horror stories. Now, there will be major spoilers for Din's inner conflict here, so there's your warning. Din grows up as a child of the Watch, in a group that already split off from Satine's reforms once. In this timeline, they double down. To them, she's the symbol of everything that went wrong. The Duchess who weakened Mandalore, trusted the Republic, and opened the door to Imperial glassing. So Din hears that version first, framed as a cautionary tale. But he also hears smugglers on Navarro mutter about Kryze the Good, or an old armorer quietly admit that Satine faced Deathwatch unarmed and didn't flinch. That mixed narrative hits him hard when Bo-Katan and the Darksaber enter the story. In canon, Din mostly has the Creed and some vague ideas about Mandalore. Here, the idea that a ruler could be Mandalorian and pacifist isn't theoretical. It's recent history. So when Bo talks about uniting clans and restoring Mandalore, Din isn't just thinking of warriors marching under a black blade. He's subconsciously comparing her to the Duchess, who tried to rebuild slowly and protect civilians first. I thought it would be fun to push that even further. Imagine Din, post-season 2, hearing for the very first time that Satine Kryze is still alive somewhere in the Outer Rim, and that she has very specific opinions about what it means to be the Mandalore, Darksaber or not. Now let's get started with that meeting, because if Din hears the Duchess is alive, he's not thinking of some frail old woman on a backwater moon. He's thinking boss fight, Darksaber duel, the whole thing. Instead, Bo-Katan sends him to a quiet refugee settlement in the Outer Rim, where the most dangerous weapon is probably an overcooked stew. Din walks through a garden, not a war room. There are kids chasing a ball, old helmets used as flower pots, and laundry lines where old Mandalorian capes hang next to plain civilian clothes. At the center of all this, on a stone bench, is Satine Kryze, decades older, wrapped in simple robes with just a faint echo of her old Duchess colors. When Din approaches, Grogu tucked in that floating pram, she looks up and smiles in a way that tells us she's already guessed who sent him. Now, there will be major spoilers for Satine's whole philosophy here, so there's your warning. She studies Din's armor, the Mudhorn's signet, the way his hand is always resting near his blaster, and then the way that same hand automatically shifts to steady Grogu's pod. In that one motion, she sees both Death Watch's legacy and something gentler they never allowed themselves to show. She even quotes that old joke from the Clone Wars era, that Mandalorians never walk anywhere if they can crash a gunship through the door, then quietly adds that Din seems to be the sort who knocks first when a child is watching. That's her read, a devout warrior bound by creed, but already bending for one small foundling. Their conversation turns to foundlings very quickly. Din explains in that clipped formal way that foundlings are the future, that they were all once lost children taken in by the covert. Satine nods, almost relieved. She tells him that this, right here, is the best of Mandalore. Warriors who turn orphans into family instead of cannon fodder. But she warns him that if you only ever raise them to fight, you're just teaching them new ways to die on different battlefields. As I said, this is where she pushes him. She asks about his creed, about this is the way. Can that way include rebuilding cities, not just armor? Can it include mercy for beaten enemies? Can it allow a Mandalorian to lay down arms once Mandalore is safe? Or are they condemned to be soldiers forever, even in peacetime? Din doesn't have clean answers. He talks about the children of the Watch, about the helmet, about duty. Satine gently counters with her own timeline, how clinging too tightly to old codes shattered Mandalore long before the Purge ever scorched the surface. When he finally leaves, the sun is low. Grogu looks back at her, curious. Satine calls out one last thing. The Darksaber, she says, is just metal. The stories Mandalorians choose to tell about it will decide whether their children live in war or peace. And then she adds that Bo-Katan is not the only one the blade is watching. I thought it would be fun to leave it there, because Din freezes mid-step, and we don't yet know which story he's going to choose. Now, let's get started on Satine herself, because if Din is frozen there in that corridor, she's already walked a very long road to reach this version of Mandalore. The woman who once tried to pull all the blasters off the streets is now quietly blessing a covert full of armored warriors. So how far did she bend without breaking? In the early Clone Wars part of this timeline, Satine is still the strict pacifist ruler we remember from the show. She dismantles the old warrior infrastructure, refuses Republic garrisons, and argues with Obi-Wan and the Jedi Council that Mandalore cannot survive by becoming soldiers again. That's the Satine who watched her world burn in the old civil wars and swore, in her words, that violence is never the answer. The key difference now is that she survives long enough to see that absolutism tested. The first big compromise is Bo-Katan's rebellion against Maul. Satine does not pick up a rifle, but she does something almost more radical for her. She publicly endorses a military uprising. She frames it as a police action to remove an illegitimate usurper, not a glorious crusade. When she stands beside Bo and Ahsoka during the alternate siege of Mandalore, her orders are about evacuation routes, medical corridors, and surrender terms. As I said, she's not chasing victory. She's chasing the lowest possible body count. From there, the compromises keep stacking. In exile under the early Empire, Satine authorizes a quiet Mandalorian military rebuilding program. Old clones train hidden squads, armor forges reopen, and children learn to shoot again. On paper, that looks like she abandoned everything. In practice, she draws hard red lines. No raids for plunder, no preemptive strikes, no taking contracts that turn Mandalorians into the Empire's attack dogs. Defense only. Protect colonies, smuggle refugees, sabotage TIE factories that target civilians. That's it. Her coordination with the broader Rebel Alliance follows the same pattern. Satine will share intel, supply safe houses, and even greenlight joint operations, but she refuses terror tactics or anything that smells of revenge. When a hot-headed cell leader suggests giving the imps a taste of their own medicine on a civilian world, she shuts him down with something very Obi-Wan. We must be guardians of the peace, not soldiers of fortune. Now, there will be major spoilers for her reputation here, so there's your warning. Because some fans in universe do turn on her, they were raised on the early new Mandalorian speeches and say she's no longer a pacifist at all. This is where the distinction matters. Early Satine is almost absolutist. All violence is corruption. Older Satine has shifted to principled non-aggression. Force is a tragic tool reserved for shielding the helpless, never for conquest or pride. One is rigidity, the other is a living ethic in a changing galaxy. Pattern interrupt, though. We are not crowning her flawless. Her aggressive disarmament before the war made Mandalore fragile, and she admits it. That mistake is what pushes her to bend later instead of snapping back into dogma. I thought it would be fun to end this section on that note, because her growth doesn't erase who she was. It makes her complex enough that the next episode of this timeline can actually break her heart again. So now that we've watched Satine bend without breaking, we need to zoom out and ask the big question. How much does saving one person actually move the needle in Star Wars? I thought it would be fun to treat this whole thing like a galactic balance sheet and see what really changes on the timeline, and what the Force refuses to let us touch. First, the fixed points stay brutally fixed. Anakin still falls. The visions, the fear, Palpatine whispering about unnatural powers, all of that still grinds him down. Satine's alive, but she's not in the room on Mustafar, and she can't reach into that bond between Anakin and Padmé the way Obi-Wan and Ahsoka almost do. Order 66 still fires. The clones still turn on the Jedi, because one more Mandalorian voice of reason can't unwind decades of Sith planning and inhibitor chips buried in every squad. From there, the original trilogy landmarks line up almost shot for shot. Alderaan still dies under Tarkin's "fear will keep the local systems in line" speech. Even if some of Satine's diplomats are on the surface, trying to argue for Mandalorian neutrality, the Battle of Yavin still ends with Luke closing his eyes and trusting the Force. The Emperor still gets thrown down that reactor shaft on the second Death Star. So there's your warning. We are not rewriting the saga's spine. Now, there will be major spoilers, but the core episodes you know stay emotionally intact. Where things really twist is in the connective tissue. Mandalore's political trajectory is totally different. Instead of a shell-shocked world that the Empire can scatter with one purge, we get a people who already spent years reconciling pacifism with necessary defense under Satine and Bo-Katan. That means when the rebellion starts to coalesce, you don't just have scattered mercenaries, you have Mandalorian task forces showing up at Yavin or Hoth with codes of conduct, not just contracts. That bleeds into the ethics and strength of the rebellion. Bail, Mon Mothma, and Satine arguing strategy in the same room is a very different vibe from shoot first and hope Saw Gerrera doesn't show up. They were still outgunned, of course, but now there's a consistent push for protecting civilians, for evacuations before strikes, for not turning into the thing they hate. Obi-Wan benefits too. As I said, he still loses Anakin, but he doesn't lose absolutely everything. Knowing Satine is alive, working, and resisting gives him a thread of emotional resilience on Tatooine, a reason to keep believing that compassion can survive empires. On the Force side, Satine becomes another bright node. Not a Jedi, not a Sith, but a persistent, stubborn light aligned with life and diplomacy. The dark still rises, but the ledger is a little less lopsided, which might be part of why Luke and Leia managed to pull Vader back instead of dying in that throne room. By the sequels, Mandalorians are a misunderstood nation instead of a rumor about random armor for hire. They're fractured, but there's a shared story about Satine and Bo-Katan that keeps them talking across clans. The New Republic still underestimates them, still files them under trouble, but there's an organized, value-driven diaspora under all the scars. So is saving Satine worth it? if it means a longer, bloodier Mandalorian resistance and even harsher Imperial retaliation. Or is that the price the galaxy had to pay for one more light that refused to go out? So when we zoom in on the emotional side of this timeline, the first thing we feel is that saving Satine doesn't magically give anyone a fairy tale ending. It just means the tragedy stretches out over decades instead of peaking in that throne room on Mandalore. Obi-Wan and Satine, in this version, never run off together, never have that quiet farm on Naboo joke turn into an actual epilogue. What they get instead is a long, disciplined, painfully honest partnership. They were allies who only rarely shared the same room, but constantly shared the same purpose. Now, there will be major spoilers for Obi-Wan's whole emotional arc here, so there's your warning. Through the Clone Wars, through the rise of the Empire, they become two distant lights that keep checking in on each other across the stars, saying without words, "I'm still here, keep going." For Satine herself, survival is not a reward, it's a sentence. She lives to see Mandalore occupied, bombarded, scattered. Every time she signs off on a covert weapon shipment, every time she lets Bo-Katan arm another cell, she adds another stone to the weight she's been carrying since the new Mandalorians first took power. As I said, her whole philosophy was built on the belief that Mandalorians could be more than warriors. Now she has to watch her people survive only because they remember how to fight. Bo-Katan's journey shifts too. In canon, her arc is drenched in guilt. Death Watch, Maul, the fall of Mandalore. Here, Satine living through all of that means Bo doesn't just inherit a throne or a symbol, she inherits her sister's expectations. She goes from the hot-headed fighter who thought the old ways were fun to the commander who has to sit through endless strategy calls, listening to Satine quietly ask, "What happens to the civilians in this plan?" Eventually, Bo's story is less about atoning for past sins and more about choosing, over and over, to carry the burden of leadership rather than run from it. And then there's Maul. His greatest victory, in canon, is breaking Obi-Wan's heart in that throne room. In this timeline, he fails. Satine lives, Obi-Wan does not fall, and Maul is left chasing an enemy he can wound but never truly destroy. When we finally reach that Twin Suns episode on Tatooine, his death feels even emptier. All those years of plotting, all those squads of criminals and Mandalorians he threw away, and the two people he tried to shatter are still quietly holding the line. So, was tragedy avoided, or just reassigned? I thought it would be fun to end this part by saying that saving one life doesn't cancel the cost of the war. It rearranges who pays it. Now, let's get started on what that really means for the galaxy's future, and who has to break so that everyone else can stand. So, when we talk about who has to break so everyone else can stand, this AU quietly asks a brutal question. What if Obi-Wan refuses to break, and still does the right thing? Now, there will be major spoilers for how that reshapes some core Star Wars ideas, so there's your warning. The first big one is attachment versus duty. In canon, Obi-Wan loses Satine and then Anakin, and the Jedi read that as proof that attachment leads to ruin. Here, Satine survives, and Obi-Wan carries that living attachment into exile. He still chooses the mission over running away with her. He still walks into the Death Star knowing he won't walk out. The problem isn't that he loves, it's how he loves. His attachment becomes a promise to protect, not a demand to possess, which is exactly where Anakin falls. Anakin clings, Obi-Wan releases. That ties straight into pacifism versus resistance. Satine's entire government was built on refusing to return Mandalore to warrior culture. Drop that woman into a galaxy of Sith, Empires, and Purge troopers, and the timeline forces her to evolve. She and Bo-Katan end up arguing over how far they can go without becoming Death Watch with better branding. We see her approve targeted resistance, evacuation corridors, and those stun only unless fired upon orders. Survival requires force, but not hatred. It's the difference between Luke throwing his saber aside and Vader cutting the Emperor down. Now, as I said, Star Wars is always telling a generational story. In this version, Satine and Obi-Wan are one link in a much longer chain. Their choices echo into Bo-Katan's refusal to kneel to the Empire. into a Mandalorian culture that still remembers a pacifist Duchess, into Din taking off his helmet for Grogu because this is the way is less important than this is my kid. The clones had Domino Squad. Mandalore gets its own messy little squad of leaders trying to do better with what they inherit. But tragedy doesn't vanish, it just moves. Mandalore still burns in the Purge, clones still execute Order 66. Maul still loses everything he thought he'd stolen. This AU doesn't fix Star Wars, it rotates the camera. We trade one heart-shattering death in a throne room for slower, longer heartbreaks. A Duchess signing away autonomy to save refugees, a Jedi watching the woman he loves grow old under occupation. So which version hits you harder? The clean, brutal finality of Satine's death, or the long, complicated hope of her survival? I thought it would be fun to end this section by asking what that answer says about the kind of Star Wars stories you love most, and then, in the next part, follow this altered Mandalorian legacy all the way to Din, Grogu, and the Darksaber's future. Now, let's get started by walking this whole alternate timeline from Maul's throne room all the way to Din's helmet, so we can really feel what changed and what stayed painfully the same. We began with that brutal scene on Mandalore. Maul ignites the saber, Satine falls, Obi-Wan breaks. But here, the blade misses her heart by centimeters, and Bo-Katan's people and Republic medics pull off a miracle. Satine survives, barely, and her recovery turns into a slow war between her ideals and the reality closing in. The new Mandalorians rearm just enough. Death Watch is pushed to compromise, and Obi-Wan is forced to live with hope instead of clean grief. From there, the Siege of Mandalore plays out differently. Satine, Bo-Katan, and Ahsoka form a tense little squad at the top, combining pacifist negotiation, warrior tactics, and Jedi improvisation. They still bring Maul down, of course, but Satine insists on a public trial that never happens because Order 66 crashes in. Mandalore doesn't fall to Maul's chaos this time. It falls to Palpatine's new empire, and Satine has to choose exile over becoming a puppet ruler. During the Purge era, she's a wandering stateswoman. While the clones turn on the Jedi, she's slipping through back channels, helping Bo-Katan evacuate civilians, and quietly steering survivors toward early rebel cells. Obi-Wan, now a hopeful hermit on Tatooine instead of a broken one, keeps in touch through rare, risky messages. Their bond doesn't fix Anakin's fall, but it means Kenobi faces his exile with a purpose, and a person still out there who believes in him. As I said earlier, the rebellion in this timeline has a Mandalorian spine. Satine becomes that elder stateswoman in the shadows, the one Bail and Mon Mothma consult when they need a culture that has already lived through disarmament and occupation. Bo-Katan is a tempered warrior leader now, scarred by compromise, trying to keep Mandalorian clans alive instead of only chasing honor. Maul is a thwarted avenger, obsessed with the fact that his greatest revenge never fully landed, reduced to a ghost haunting the margins of a galaxy that moved past him. By the time we reach the Mandalorian, Din is walking into a legacy that's much more complicated. There are legends of Satine's mercy, as well as Vizsla's fury, stories of pacifist cities and secret resistance cells. Now, there will be major spoilers for where we're heading next, so there's your warning. One spared life doesn't magically heal this galaxy. It just carves out new pockets where mercy, strategy, and culture can survive long enough to matter. So the big questions we opened with still sting. How far can Satine bend before she stops being Satine? Does Mandalore's fate change, or just the shape of its scars? And is the cost of resistance worth the gains when worlds still burn? This AU is bittersweet on purpose. It's less power fantasy and more a new angle on core Star Wars themes. Attachment and loss, war and principle, found family and found nations. In the next section, we'll push that all the way to Din, Grogu, and what the Darksaber actually means in a galaxy where Satine once lived to see it fall. Now we've walked this whole thing through, from a single failed execution on Mandalore to Din and Grogu walking through a galaxy Satine helped shape. The question is, which story hits you harder? The canon, pure tragedy where Maul's blade ends her life in that throne room? Or this longer, messier survival timeline where her ideals echo all the way to the New Republic? As I said, this AU was never meant to erase the heartbreak. It was meant to reframe it. So there's your warning. Now it's your turn in the timeline. In the comments, tell me where you'd lock in the big decision points. Should Satine have stayed on Mandalore during the Purge and gone down with her people, turning her into a martyr that Bo-Katan and the scattered clans rally around for generations? Or do you think she should have taken the Darksaber herself at some point, finally accepting that Mandalore needed a ruler who could wield both a blade and a peace manifesto? I thought it would be fun to imagine her standing opposite Moff Gideon or even Maul one last time, Darksaber drawn, quoting, "I will not be provoked," while absolutely being provoked. Or do you prefer the path where she leaves the throne earlier, joins the rebellion in secret, and becomes one of those quiet founders the Hollows never talk about? Now, let's get started on the really wild what-ifs. Drop your own versions of Obi-Wan's story. Does he ever break his Tatooine exile for one last meeting with Satine? An episode-length conversation that changes how he talks to Luke later? Do you want a timeline where Satine mentors Leia directly, teaching her how to balance Senate speeches with Mandalorian steel, turning hope into actual policy? Or take Grogu. In this AU, does he spend a few silent years in a Mandalorian enclave, shaped by her new Mandalorian ideals, raised by warriors who were taught not to love war? Imagine Din trying to explain to a tiny Grogu why some Mandalorians never take off their helmets while Aunt Satine used to hold public peace rallies on the same streets. Of course, the whole point of this channel is to treat these what-ifs with the same care we give the canon episodes. We put everything in order, walk the full timeline, and connect those emotional beats so they feel like they could sit right next to the show. If you want more long-form, chronologically structured Star Wars explorations, more deep-dive AUs, and straight canon breakdowns in this same style, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this with your squad. Most importantly, drop your own Satine survival timelines in the comments so this story doesn't end here. We built one path through the galaxy. Now I want to see yours.